Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin.com friends and Formula One fans. The Verstappen show continues in China. The next victory for the world champion. It was the expected dominant performance by Verstappen and Red Bull for the big story, for the headlines. But it was someone else who made the headlines, namely Max Verstappen's former teammate Daniel Ricciardo. He's actually known for his smile, he's actually known for always being in a good mood, but I've never seen him like he was after the Chinese Grand Prix. That guy, Daniel Ricciardo, said, and that of course went to Lance Stroll. I already got a bit of translation help from you yesterday in fecal language. I would translate it with your help like this: sleep together with this guy. Well, Daniel Ricciardo, what made him feel like that afterwards? We really have to say again at this point, it wasn't a radio message, it wasn't in the heat of the moment, it wasn't emotionally charged, it was after the race when he spoke to us writing journalists, when he said that. Well, what happened anyway? We're going into lap 26, about halfway through the Chinese Grand Prix. The safety car was out, it was on its way back into the pits, restart, and then it happens, as it always does. The leader at the front sets the pace, and there can be a backlog at the back of the field. At the end of the long straight, there's the hairpin, where the whole field was pushed close together, yes, and a bit too close for Lance Stroll. He really crashed into the back of Daniel Ricciardo, rear end collision in turn 14, and he crashed into the back of him so hard that Daniel Ricciardo's Racing Bull was about half a meter in the air, so it wasn't just a slight tether up the back, it was quite serious. Ricciardo, for his part, was then pushed into Oscar Piastri. It looked a bit like he was already in the back of Piastri anyway, but no, he wasn't yet in the back of Piastri. He was relatively close, but driving very, very slowly. Then Stroll came with excess and pushed him in. For Daniel Ricciardo, that meant retirement. He tried again to continue. We'll talk about that later, but it was pointless. His car was too badly damaged. The action itself, you can understand that Daniel Ricciardo was not thrilled about it. He is currently fighting for his career. Now this weekend things were going much better for him performance-wise with the new chassis than the retirement. But it wasn't the action itself that really upset him. What really upset Daniel Ricciardo was the radio message from Lance Stroll. In this radio message directly after the accident, Stroll called Ricciardo an idiot, i.e. said who was to blame for the accident, which Daniel Ricciardo was not prepared to accept. That's why he said that Lance Stroll's statement made his blood boil. He is still holding back. So you heard what he literally said earlier, but says, I'm still holding back because maybe in an hour, maybe he'll look at it again and then take responsibility for it. If not, then I can no longer help him, then nobody can help him. Daniel Ricciardo continues. Now you can imagine what kind of mood he was in. Lance Stroll also had his say, of course, away from the cockpit, then afterwards to us journalists writing. He says, no, why should I have been to blame? It was just an accordion effect. Those in front of me all braked so stupidly, and now I'm the one to blame because I drove into the back of them. Daniel Ricciardo also analyzed the scene in a bit more detail. On the one hand, he was very, very angry because he was called an idiot for an action that was completely beyond his control. On the other hand, he just analyzed the scene and said, take a look at this. Lance, don't look ahead now, which is what he should be doing. His only job is to keep an eye on the car in front, in this case Ricciardo, and not drive into the back of him. But what does Stroll do? He doesn't look at the car in front, but looks inwards to the apex of the corner, concentrating more on the restart at the front in order to get out of there as quickly as possible, instead of simply protecting the car in front. When Stroll then looks ahead, at some point again, he's already hanging off the back of Ricciardo. Yes, as we said earlier, Ricciardo was 50 centimeters in the air. It wasn't just a momentary lapse of concentration that caused him to hit something. No, it was really with excess in the rear. Ricciardo says he wants to see what Stroll says about him in the media. I've already said that he's being relatively unreasonable, so he doesn't want to take that on himself. Daniel Ricciardo also says, well, if Stroll still accuses him after, then he will say more. So I'm now looking forward to the media day in Miami to see whether Daniel Ricciardo will put on the boxing gloves. That could certainly be interesting. The incident was also interesting because the stewards saw the whole thing the same way as the Australian. They expressed themselves a little more selectively, but said that Lance Stroll was largely to blame for the whole thing, that he could have anticipated that all the drivers in front of him would slow down, and that's why they gave him a 10-second penalty. The 10-second penalty didn't really matter. Stroll had to come into the pits immediately after the incident to have his nose changed, and his race was over anyway, so the 10-second penalty did not hurt him anymore. For Daniel Ricciardo, however, things got really bad. I've already said that he kept going at first, had to retire in the end. The damage to his car was back, but he got a penalty afterwards. 3 grid positions for the next race in Miami. What was he guilty of? No, it wasn't his choice of words that was his undoing, but the scene is a bit more complicated, as is so often the case in Formula One. So a rear-end collision, Stroll crashing into the rear of Daniel Ricciardo, with Nico Hülkenberg lurking directly behind, and of course he saw, okay, there's been an accident, I'm going to pass both of them. The regulations also allow it, because the two clearly had a problem, because actually you're only allowed to overtake again from the finish line, but Hülkenberg passed the two before that and said, okay, they had a problem, there was an accident. The regulations say, okay, that's okay, but Daniel Ricciardo was so on his 180 that he didn't think it was okay for Nico Hülkenberg to just drive past. Now there was another safety car phase immediately afterwards, and then again on the very next lap. Why? We'll talk about that in a moment. And then Daniel Ricciardo said, well, then I'll just get the position back, and simply drove past Nico Hülkenberg. He first asked in the pits, can I get the position back? Then the pit said, well, we'll check that. He said, I don't care anyway, I'll go past. A case of vigilante justice. The stewards said he shouldn't have done it, and that's why he was penalized for the next race. Very bitter, of course. He could have finished the race and perhaps would have received a penalty straight away. It just didn't turn out that way, which shows once again that you have to think about the penalty for the future, because Lance Stroll, who actually caused the whole thing, got off scot-free. Got off scot-free, if you like, and Ricciardo was also penalized for the next race. So that's bitter. But of course he blew a fuse, not only after the race with his statements, but also there with this vigilante justice. Of course he should know better. The next safety car phase, which I've already mentioned, was triggered by an incident between Kevin Magnussen and Yuki Tsunoda. The Haas driver flipped the Racing Bull, and so the Racing Bulls actually lost 2 cars in half a lap. The race was really over for Yuki Tsunoda. His car was on the track, debris was lying around, so he had to call out the safety car again. The steward saw it and penalized Kevin Magnussen, 10 seconds for him too. The Dane says, well, actually it was more of a racing incident for him, but in the end it didn't make any difference to him. There was another 10-second penalty for Logan Sargent. He also overtook Nico Hülkenberg under the safety car, but it was a different constellation. Hülkenberg was coming out of the pit lane. Sargent was at the safety car line at that exact moment, and he was probably a bit behind, but past Hülkenberg, which is why he was penalized later. We have another penalty for you, namely 10,000 euros for Alpine. What was going on there? You may have seen it. Pierre Gasly's pit stop went wrong, and the mechanic was slightly affected because Gasly set off too early. The driver is not to blame at all, but we have to say quite clearly at this point that he had the green light, i.e. the signal to set off. He did that well, but the tire change wasn't finished yet. Fortunately, they were able to stop again, so the mechanic got off lightly, was only slightly injured, was able to continue the rest of the race, at least halfway okay on the side. But of course the FIA doesn't like that very, very much. There are regulations that say when a pit stop can really be released, when the green light comes on. There are various safety mechanisms that didn't apply in this case because a mechanic had problems, but the system simply went green, which is not allowed to happen. Hence this penalty, which I think was relatively light. Alpine could have been worse off because it's a very dangerous situation. So it's lucky that nothing more happened and that no harsher penalty was imposed. It's definitely not a punishment to work for us, at least in the editorial department, I promise you that. And if you want to try it out, jobs.motorsport-magazin.com, maybe you already have previous experience, then you can start directly with us in the editorial department here in Graz. Maybe you want to get a taste of it first with an internship, but everything at our location in Graz. It's also a descent city. You can endure it quite well. Now we look at the driver of the day, Lando Norris, who sensationally finished second, and that was quite unexpected, even unexpected for McLaren themselves, because they had expected a difficult race. You also saw yesterday's sprint. Lando Norris did well at the start, dropped a long way back, but then the performance in the race trim wasn't really right either. The track wasn't really supposed to suit the car, so you didn't expect that. Nevertheless, he finished second in the end. How could that be? On the one hand, because of the setup, they opened Parc Fermé again, were able to make changes after the sprint, and we heard Norris say on the radio after the sprint that yes, we already have an idea of what we can do to protect the rear axle better. And that's a crucial point. We already discussed it a little bit yesterday. Shanghai is no longer as much about the front axle as it used to be. It was more the rear axle that was the problem this weekend. Then they made setup changes and the weather suited McLaren. It was surprisingly cool, which very few people had expected, and that allowed them to protect the rear axle even more. But then there was also some real luck, because the safety car phase naturally came at the right moment for Lando Norris and McLaren. Actually, and Red Bull also said this, Christian Horner made it quite clear it would probably have been a 1-2 for us. We went for the fastest strategy, which was 2 stops, so Verstappen and Perez were already in the pits. Charles Leclerc and Lando Norris, who went for 1 stop, weren't in the pits at that point. They got this pit stop for free, so they also got the track position. Leclerc then held off Perez a bit, and Perez then had no chance against Norris in the end. At one point, it looked as if Norris was a real unlucky driver, because there was a VSC phase at first. He was just past the pit lane when VSC was called. The VSC phase then lasted long enough for him to complete his pit stop, then a safety car. Then the gaps were reduced as a result, and additional pit stops. So that turned out very well for him, but without the right pace, it wouldn't have been enough. On the one hand, it was surprising that he was able to stay so far ahead, even ahead of Perez in the end. But on the other hand, it was surprising how bad Ferrari actually was in race trim. In qualifying, we knew by now that this is no longer the Scuderia's real strength. They said, yes, we've geared the setup a bit more towards the race, but in the race there wasn't much progress. A bit more in the first stint, but we burned up the tyres in traffic after a weak start lap. But then in the second half of the race on the hard tyres, nothing worked at all. Charles Leclerc said that he lost half a second per lap on these hard tyres, which is quite unusual because the strength of the car is that it works in all conditions, and in this case it didn't. Lando Norris, position 2, driver of the day, and team colleague Oscar Piastri, the former prodigy, only in 8th position. Has Oscar Piastri now been disenchanted? Yes and no. It has to be said that Piastri is usually well behind Lando Norris in the race trim. In this case, it was again the case that he couldn't quite keep up with Norris, but it wasn't as drastic as it looked in the end, because the incident caused by Lance Stroll behind the safety car pushed Daniel Ricciardo into his compatriot, into Oscar Piastri, and his car was no longer okay afterwards. He lost a lot of downforce. The car no longer had the same rear axle as before, which cost him around 0.4 of a second per lap, according to team boss Andrea Stella, so we have to defend him a little. Nevertheless, it is a trend that is emerging again and again that Piastri has a bit of a problem with pure performance when Norris doesn't make any mistakes, especially in race trim. It wasn't just in race trim that Lewis Hamilton had problems this weekend. The big mistake yesterday in qualifying, so already out in Q1, only 18th on the grid, and I announced a great race because out of position and so on. Yes, for Lewis Hamilton, it didn't go so fast at first. He really struggled back there. He said the car is so slow, I can't even get to it. The soft tires at the start were the worst tires for him, so he complained on the radio. It really didn't go much forward. In the end, he still finished 9th. Of course, the safety car also played into his hands, but he only finished 2.5 seconds behind Nico Hülkenberg. You really have to let that sink in. After the race, he talked about having had more understeer than ever before in his life. So he was really anything but happy with his car, and that after a sprint, how can that be? Now you can say setup, Parc Fermé was open, they made a mistake. Mercedes also said they did something seriously different, but slowly the setup is no longer a valid excuse. His teammate George Russell still managed to finish 6th, but of course that's not great either, especially after a good starting lap. But he said, well, setup or no setup, in the end, the setup is the icing on the cake. We just need downforce, downforce, downforce. That's what brings lap times, and then maybe the setup brings us a nuance forward or whatever. But in the end, we need downforce. Now, he said it out loud. We say it very clearly in our current print edition in issue number 96, Lost in Space, which fits perfectly with the star with the silver arrows. What went wrong? There is a chronology of the Mercedes crash. There is also a big story about what is currently going wrong. Make sure you get it, abo.motorsport-magazin.com, and you don't have to wait 2 weeks until Miami. You can look forward to another exciting video here on this channel the very next day. AVD Motorsport Magazine with Christian Danner. Make sure you watch it, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell. Then you won't miss it.